a licensed clinical psychologist in the Virginia State University Psychology Department program. She is a business owner. She does clinical work in schools and various other settings, and we're lucky to have her here to talk to you today about mental health. I hope you enjoy her presentation.
Hello, and good afternoon, good morning, depending on when you're watching this. I'm thrilled and excited to be here with you today, and as Dr. Boyd said, I'll be talking with you about mental health. Well, for starters, let's just make sure we're clear about what mental health is. It basically is conceptualized as a state of well-being, and this state of well-being includes a person being able to be comfortable with their own attributes, a person that feels good about what they can contribute to society, and a person that's able to manage daily life crises or stressors, if you will, without being totally overwhelmed. So that's the broad definition of mental health. Now that we've talked about that, let's take a moment and go into a bit more detail. There's mental health disorders. And so when we talk about a mental health disorder, this has to do with syndromes. These syndromes can have a significant impact on an individual's cognition or their way of thinking, on their ability to regulate their emotions, and can also have a tremendous impact on their behavior. And so when we talk about a mental health disorder, we also have to be clear that it's not something that would happen in everyday life. So for example, say if someone's close relative or loved one or a beloved friend passed away, and if the person was really sad because that individual passed away, that wouldn't necessarily constitute the definition for a mental health disorder. Typically with a mental health disorder, the issue is so significant and so severe that it creates significant stress and or disability to the point where the person cannot function socially, occupationally, or isn't even able to take care of important activities for the day. Now, when we talk about mental health disorders, we've got to make sure that we're clear about how often they occur. And so typically with mental health disorders, with children, they tend to occur 1 in every 4. And with adults, they tend to occur 1 in every 5. I have a slide that I'd like to show you that gives you a bit more information about mental health disorders, and then I'd like to share a brief statistic with you. So here, as a matter of fact, you see adults with 1 in every 5 that typically have a mental health disorder age 15 and older. Look over here at this slide. And what you can see is that between the ages of 18 and 25, typically there's only 4.8% that meet diagnostic criteria for a mental health disorder. And then you have between the ages of 26 and 49, you can see that 4.9% meet that diagnostic criteria there, and the 3.1% in the 50 and older population. So you might be saying to yourself, well, what are all the other people who have the mental health disorders? Those people would be below the age of 18. Hence, when we talk about with the adults, it's typically 1 in 5, and I think I said that right earlier. With the children, it's typically 1 in 4. And so there's some interesting statistics, though, that I'd like to share with you. And I laid the sheet here just so that I could be sure to get it correct. So, some people think that just because someone has a mental health disorder, that it makes them violent or a menace to society and grossly unpredictable. And I wanted to share with you some recent research that was published in the American Psychological Association in 2016. And what they found is that overall mass shootings by people with serious mental illnesses only represent about 1% of all gun homicides each year. And it went on to say that the vast majority of individuals with a mental health problem, they're no more likely to be violent than anyone else. As a matter of fact, it says that most people with a mental illness are not only 3 to 5% less likely to commit a crime, but they're also more likely to be the recipient of a crime committed towards them. In fact, people with severe mental illnesses are over 10% more likely to be victims of a violent crime. And so I say that because I think it's critical for us to understand that just because someone meets diagnostic criteria for a mental health disorder, it doesn't necessarily make them more dangerous or more of a menace to our society. So then, why is it important to understand the mental health disorders? We see that there's, not quite as many people who's going to have them, even though we do have some. But what we do know is there's a milder view or a broader view that we typically like to look at, and that view are mental health problems. This is a huge category. Most all of us can fall within this category. When we talk about mental health problems, it's really talking about individuals who have some of the symptoms of a mental health disorder, but does not quite yet meet that criteria for it. And what we find is that sometimes those problems could be with the way they think. They could either think irrationally or have distorted thinking. At other times, the problem could be with how they regulate their emotions, how long it takes for them to calm down, if their anger outbursts are grossly out of proportion to the act that happened to them. And then the last one has to do with their behavior. We find that some people have some mental health problems, if you will, when their behavior is such that it continues to induce risk to themselves or put themselves at risk, or cause them to prey on others or put other members in society at risk. This area of mental health problems could be experienced by most all of us. Typically, it's because of these mental health problems that most people have an issue. I want to share some other information with you that I thought was pretty interesting. And so there's some research that was done, and this sort of brings us to the adolescents or the younger people who typically engage in violence in the school setting. And what we found within one of the journals that was published by the Journal of Forensic Psychiatry and Psychology is that violence prevention programs have been incredibly successful at reducing violence in the United States of America. As a matter of fact, though, the World Health Organization has identified youth violence as a global public concern. And what they also know is that in the United States of America, the annual cost of juvenile violence on the state criminal justice system has been estimated to be something like $46 million. That's a whopping number. So you can see why we're trying to do this intervention, if you will, to reduce youth violence. The last piece that I want to get into is, so we've talked about mental health disorders, we've talked about mental health, we've talked about the problems. Now I want to talk about a crisis. So if you have a mental health problem, that could lead to a mental health crisis. A crisis is typically any situation when an individual is not able to manage a situation without putting either themselves at risk or someone else at risk. It's also when they're not able to receive help or support from others that are around them. There's so many things that can cause a mental health crisis. One could be just increased stress. Increased stress could come from struggling with your schoolwork. It could come from things that are going on in the home. It could come from a friendship breakup. It could come from a number of things, but this is just one area. Also, a crisis could be caused by changes in the family situation. If there are some dynamics where one relative leaves the home, or where parents separate, or if a loved one dies or something like that. So can bullying in the school and worrying about grades, as I previously mentioned in friends, substance use or medication and lack thereof, and last but certainly not least, there's the whole medical illness. All of these things could trigger a crisis. And then we now have to be on guard to make sure we are checking for whether or not we're having mental health problems or whether or not there's a crisis on the inside of us. With that mental health crisis, we believe there's something that can be done even prior to it happening. And the reason why we believe that is because 98% of the time, just before there's a mental health crisis, we do know that plenty of times there's something called a trigger. A trigger is anything, an act or event that serves as a stimulus or as an initiator, if you will, of some type of reaction from the participant. So a trigger could be someone calling someone a bad name. A trigger could also be someone seeing someone else harmed or humiliated. Any of these things could serve as a trigger. They sometimes can be difficult to predict, particularly if you don't know the individual. They always, typically, most always tend to have a warning sign. And then third, they can often set off, as I mentioned, that mental health crisis. It's often connected, though, to an individual's beliefs. When that trigger happens, what we know from a cognitive behavioral perspective is whether or not it is perceived as a crisis or not depends on how that person interprets that event. So how that person thinks and their belief is critical and important. And so one of the things that we want to do is make sure that when situations happen and when there are triggers, that we take a moment, take a deep breath, and practice perhaps some relaxation techniques or calm ourselves down so that we can think clearly. Perhaps this is a good point to take a quick break, take a deep breath, calm ourselves down. So hey, let's all stand up. I've been talking for a little bit. And as you stand up, if you can just take your hands and stretch them all the way to the top, that should feel pretty good. Also, what you're doing is you're tensing some of your muscles. And after just a little bit, you can bring them right back down. Another piece of relaxation, and you'll have a chance to see this in the virtual reality world, has to do with a breathing pattern, or sometimes focusing on an event. All of these things can help calm us. We're in the